transphobia.
Murray Black. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to start with saying that I'm very proud that Scotland is one of the world's leading LGBTI+ rights countries in the world. And I'm proud that I and the Scottish Government were elected on a manifesto commitment to reforming the Gender Recognition Act in particular. Now, I know that I'm not alone in feeling like ignorance is rearing its ugly head again, but it's our job to make sure that we bring people with us. And the reality is that most folk actually don't know a lot about trans people. They don't know a lot about trans issues or the laws which we are seeking to reform. So I want to use today as an opportunity to take a little heat out of such discussions and explain and answer some of the concerns that people have with regards to the GRA and trans rights more broadly. And firstly, the GRA, the Gender Recognition Act, provides a process for trans people to obtain a GRC, a Gender Recognition Certificate, which is basically the equivalent of getting a new birth certificate, but it reflects who you are. But in order to take part in this process, at first you must pay a £140 fee, you must be over 18, you must not be married, and if you are married, spousal consent has to be given. You must have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria through medical and psychiatric reports. You must prove that you've lived for fully 2 years in your gender, and then you must present this dossier of evidence to a gender recognition panel, which we know from gathering evidence is actually a really redundant system and asks a lot of totally inappropriate and irrelevant questions. So just to talk about a couple of what the problems are with the GRA as it stands. Well, firstly, as I said, the £140 fee, not all folk can afford that. Now, where that cost can be covered in instances of low income, but it doesn't cover the cost of medical and psychiatric reports, which can cost an absolute bomb for a lot of people. This idea that you have to have spousal consent if you're married, that's a medieval kind of rule. To prove that you've lived for 2 years in a certain gender is as redundant as it is hypocritical. I mean, Action for Trans Health warned that this requirement can force trans people to conform to outdated norms of gender and behaviour. It also risks outing these individuals, because if they are challenged in those 2 years at some point, they don't have a gender recognition certificate. Therefore, they're going to find themselves in dangerous situations. So it's a totally unjustified ask. Now, finally, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria being a requirement is absolutely ridiculous, because the World Health Organization removed transgender from the International Classification of Diseases. And just to give a wee bit of, I suppose, another look at this, they removed homosexuality only in 1992. Now, gender dysphoria is defined as distress or discomfort caused by a mismatch between gender identity and that assigned at birth. Now, it's important to say that not every trans person experiences gender dysphoria. And a comparable hypothetical would be if I had to go to a doctor and get a clinical diagnosis of anxiety or depression before someone believes that I am gay. Of course, a lot of gay people experience anxiety and depression with relation to their sexuality, but that's because of the way that the world treats us at the minute. It is not a medical consequence of being gay, and the same is true of gender dysphoria with being transgender. Now, the great thing about the GRA when it first came out in 2004 was that it recognised that not all trans people are physically or mentally prepared for surgery for a whole range of nuanced and different reasons. But the everyday bigotry and ignorance that is experienced by trans people, it creates a vicious cycle of harassment and exclusion. And I, for one, understand why many trans people are too emotionally exhausted to entertain this process to even get a GRC. So the reforms that have been put forward in Scotland, and I know that this place is looking at similar reforms, is that an individual would appear in person before a Justice of the Peace to make a statutory declaration confirming the truth of their application and their intention to live in their acquired gender for the remainder of their lives. It's 2 years in jail if it's obtained by fraud. This would bring us into line with international best practice, as we already see in Argentina, Malta, Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Republic of Ireland. No evidence from any of these countries suggests that this system is abused in any way. So the Scottish Government consultation ended in March 2018, and we had 15,000 responses to that, all of which were overwhelmingly in support of the reforms. Close the Gap, Equate Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, Women 50/50 and Zero Tolerance support all these reforms, and they released a joint statement saying, "We do not regard trans equality and women's equality to contradict or be in competition with each other." Now, to be clear, there are absolutely no suggestions to change the exclusion clause in the Equality Act of 2010. And it is the Equality Act which deals with single-sex services, which is where a lot of the recent concerns that are resurfacing seem to lie. And if anyone wants to look for research, it's page 7 of the Equality Act, and it says that exclusion clauses can be used where a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim can be shown. So it's important also to follow that by saying that Rape Crisis and Women's Aid already provide trans-inclusive services on the basis of self-ID, and they have done for well over a decade. Because they appreciate that trans women are running from the same abuse, the same toxic masculinity, and the same sexual and physical violence as other women that they serve. And where we hear concerns like, well, what if, for example, an abusive male partner turns up to a refuge centre and starts self-identifying as a woman? Well, the reality is they would be treated exactly the same way as an abusive lesbian partner turning up to a refuge. These things already have answers to them. People have a right to express legitimate concerns and questions. But what I'm seeing just now is either witnessing an open attack on rights that are already established in law and have been, or we're seeing the worrying level of ignorance. Now, the only people responsible for abuse are abusers. We understand that men perpetrate more abuse against women, and we have to understand this trend if we want to challenge it. But that does not legitimise framing discussions on trans rights from the viewpoint that trans women are a threat. It's the same tactic that we see used by the far right. For example, they portray sexual crimes by Muslim men as endemic, and yet ignore the fact that most rapists and paedophiles are actually white men. We hear these arguments that we can't have a compassionate social security system because benefit scroungers, they'll just cheat it, they'll just abuse the system, when in actual fact the truth tells us that doesn't happen a lot. The bigger problem is people not claiming what they're entitled to. We see the use of fake stories or individual cases to smear entire communities against wider evidence. And the same thing happens to the trans community regularly, and it's happening just now. For me, being a feminist means dismantling the patriarchy. That patriarchy which has hurt every different identity in society in different ways, whether it be all of the battles that feminists have been fighting on women's behalf for generations, whether it be men not feeling able to talk about their mental health or seek help because they can't be seen as weak or they can't be seen as vulnerable. Even within the LGBT community, we see the harm that this patriarchy does, where we see guys who feel the need to be effeminate because they're gay, or we see women who feel the need to become butch because they're lesbian. We see all of these insecurities instilled in people, and it plays out in different ways. We live in a highly gendered and patriarchal world, and what I think that many are failing to grasp is that it's also an incredibly heterosexual and binary world, and this goes hand in hand with the patriarchy. And I say it's quite telling that there seems to be little concern, or certainly little vocal concern, for trans men and the situations that they might find themselves in. Being an LGBT ally is more than supporting our existence and rights in theory. Rather, it's demonstrating and taking the personal responsibility to educate ourselves, to face the everyday barriers and prejudices that we face. We've got to find out why is it the general welfare of trans people is so awful, given that they make up less than 1% of the population. People are right to express legitimate questions and concerns, but if they dig deep enough, I think they'll find that the answers are indeed there.